Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this 3M Motion Industries respiratory webinar. Today we're joined by Mark Reggers from the 3M Safety Division. Just a little bit about our presenter. Mark is a certified occupational hygienist and specialist application engineer with 3M Safety Division. He is a current sitting member of the several Australian standards boards, including respiratory protection and iron face protection. Mark is also the chair of the Australasian Institute of Occupational Hygienists. We're very fortunate to have Mark with us today, and you will find his presentation very interesting.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. So certainly just there's a Q&A panel in your team setting there, so don't hesitate to ask any questions that come to mind or other things respiratory related. Certainly we'll try and cover those during the webinar this morning, and anything we don't, we'll try and get back to you with that information. So we want this to be an interactive session with you all, and hopefully that you do enjoy it. The next slide there, please. So just a bit of high-level stuff before we begin. Look, obviously this information is based on the approaches of the Australian Standard 1715, which is the Selection, Use and Maintenance Australian Standard. Certainly, depending on where you may be logging in from around the world, other country requirements may be different. Certainly, we're going to be covering only for a short time this morning, as much as I'm sure you'd love to hear about respirators for a lot longer. I know I certainly usually do, but I'm slightly unique in that way. And information is fairly general that we covered on, so certainly anything we do cover, please take with a grain of salt to then go further into your specific site requirements, and please don't hesitate to reach out to the team at Motion and at 3M to help you work through some of those things that we're going to be talking through today. So if we'll go through to the next slide there, Chevron. So I usually like to start all my, PPE training presentations, talking about, respiratory protection today, just highlighting the hierarchy of control. And I'm sure many of you are more than familiar with the concept of the hierarchy control, thinking about, elimination being the most preferred, substitution, isolation as we get further down that hierarchy, down to these administrative and PPE controls. And I guess at this point, I'd like to highlight that, certainly agree that PPE is at the bottom and that's where it should be. But the point I guess I want to start off with is that if PPE is required through those combination of controls, or maybe you're in a situation where you are relying as PPE and that administrative side of things as your primary control, is that it's no less important than any one of the other controls. If you're relying on PPE, we need to have all those right things in place to have a high level of confidence, reliability, predictability, that when our workers that are out there doing a variety of different things are going to be achieving protection, being that last line of defense. On the right-hand side of the slide there, just trying to tie in that the effectiveness of PPE is so, closely tied to human behavior and the human interaction with that PPE. PPE can be very effective. There's a lot of science that goes into PPE, but just highlighting at the end of the day, if a worker thinking about respiratory protection, as we're focusing on today, chooses not to wear that respirator correctly or can't fit correctly, thinking about the compatibility, which we'll talk about today, thinking about the fit of respiratory protection, that protection is not going to be there, or it's going to be significantly reduced, or it's not going to be reliable. So this would like to usually start the presentation off trying to set the scene, why we talk so seriously about PPE, that if it is required, we need to, do all the right things. In a great situation, we wouldn't be relying on PPE, but we know that typically that's not quite the case, thinking of the variety of hazards and things that people need to do in industry. So if we go to the next slide there. Also from a high level point of view, thinking about not just respiratory protection, but PPE, three key things here that, I usually like to frame, PPE selection and respiratory protection today is these couple of these key questions. The first one being, is the PPE adequate, or is the respiratory protection adequate with our focus today? Is it right for the hazard? That's a very broad statement, but thinking about airborne hazards, is it right for the silica hazard we may be needing protection from, or welding fumes as an example, or diesel particulate matter, or respirable coal dust? Whatever it may be, or whatever that hazard is in your workplace, is it right for that hazard? And does it reduce exposure to the level required to protect the wearer's health? So this is where workplace exposure standards and Safe Work Australia and the regulators have that information that health and safety professionals and occupational hygienists use to make that evaluation. Is that reduction of exposure significant enough, getting low enough to protect the wearer's health? So is it adequate for the hazard? Then we get, is the PPE or is the respirator suitable? So you could have many types of respirators. We'll look at the family tree today. It'll say, it could be, silica dust is a very prevalent thing in industry today in regulatory focus. We have lots of different types of respirators that are adequate, but not all of them may be suitable. Thinking about what that environment is it robust enough? Thinking of some heavy industries that are out there. Is it available as far as available on site? How will it interact with other PPE? A lot of situations have, multiple types of hazards. Could be noisy, could need eye and face protection as well. So how will that respirator, is that combined? How does it interact with other PPE? Comfort is always going to come into it, thinking about this is a personal PPE. Is it comfortable? Is it bearable for the individual to do what they need to do, whatever that task is? Maintain reliable protection. And also keep that respirator, that piece of PPE on themselves to get that protection. And then does it fit? And we'll be talking a fair bit about fit later on. That protection so much relies on that fit being there. And then we get to will the PPE be worn? It's at the end of the day, if it's not being worn, clearly that protection is not going to be there. And so some of the things that we'll touch on today, what are some of those, requirements and that suitability to ultimately make sure that respirator is going to be worn for the whole time that it needs to be worn. Not a case of, I've worn it for the first 5 minutes of the day or for the task, and because it's making them too hot or it's uncomfortable or not compatible with other PPE, they may take it off or adjust it as well. So we need these three things in place to have a pretty good level of confidence that protection is going to be achieved. And we take any one of those things out, certainly that protection is not going to be there. So some sort of high level sort of things to start off the presentation today, not just for respiratory protection, but any type of PPE that you may be needing as part of your control strategy. We can go to the next slide there. Today we're focusing in on, selection of respiratory protection. And selection is a key part of a respiratory protection program. So Australian Standard 1715, Australian New Zealand Standard 1715 goes into that process for what's involved in a respiratory protection program. So once again, those disclaimers at the start there, we're touching on a small part. Hopefully this sets a baseline, a benchmark for you to ask some of those key questions as you go forward from today, or the next time you're doing a risk assessment or you're changing a task or a process. The couple of these things sticking in your mind, thinking of that respiratory protection point of view. So in Australia and New Zealand, we have two main standards. The first one there is 1750, which is one that's going to be most relevant to workplaces, which sort of covers a lot of information, things to consider, which we're going to try and, take out some of those key themes and information today. And then there's Australian Standard 1716 respiratory protection devices, which is essentially the manufacturer's standard. This is what, Australian Standard products or people that claim to meet the standard will get the test criteria from that specific standard. So they go hand in hand with each other. So certainly if you're looking to start out, 1715 is a great place to start. Next slide, please. So just from a respiratory protection program point of view, there are lots of different elements that make up an RPP, and selection is certainly part of that overall program, but it shouldn't just be a case of, hey, I've gone to the Motion website, I've found a respirator that's there and that looks fine, I'm just going to purchase it and I'm just going to give it to my worker and that's it. That should not be the situation at all. So trying to set this particular program up about the selection, which we're going to go through today, there's aspects of certainly, medical screening, are people, physically suitable to wear certain types of respiratory protection, the training and knowledge that goes along, with the particular product that may be suitable, the fitting of equipment. We'll talk about fit testing, the wearing, onto the maintenance, the disposal, record keeping, program evaluation. So there's a bit there, but we think of it like any kind of system. There's many things there, and quite often when I talk to workplaces, a lot of those things they're doing anyway by naturally saying, hey, well, we need to make sure our workers, our wearers need to know how to use this piece of equipment, so they may be doing it informally. So maybe something thinking about, well, how can we formalize or record some of these things that we're already doing, using these reference points and sections from the Australian Standard today as well. So this is one part, but commonly around the kind of questions that we most commonly get asked here at 3M with our team, and also the Motion team and workplaces are trying to figure out, where do I begin, where do I start as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, where do I start? Where does the workplace start? Thinking about, look, I know I may need to wear respiratory protection as part of my control strategy. So next slide, please. So the first key question that we need to ask ourselves or determine is, what is that respiratory airborne hazard that our workers that need protection from, or what is being produced that we need to build into our risk assessment? Three broad categories here: particulates, gases and vapors, and oxygen deficiency. So why these are key questions to ask or determine right up front is because the answer to, hey, we have particulates only, or we have gases and vapors, or we have both, will put you down a different pathway to the type of respiratory protection, the type of controls that may be required. So particulates is a bit of a catch-all term. As you can see there, that term particulates includes dusts, mists, fume, fibres, thinking about biological aerosols with the world that we've all been living with. They all sort of fall in this particulate category, and that they're all a physical thing, albeit very, very small, and quite often, well, not quite often, more commonly not the stuff that we're most concerned about, ones that we can't actually see by the naked eye. But they're all a physical thing. And we're going to look into particulate filters. Why is it that you think of, the COVID world that we've all been living through and the pandemic? Why is it a P2 that's recommended, but also a P2 for bushfire smoke, but also a P2 for diesel particulate matter? Why is it the same filter rating for these different types of hazards? But from a selection point of view, they're all a type of particulate. Then we get to gases and vapors. The thinking of gases as it's in a gaseous state at room temperature. It doesn't change states. It's not in a liquid or a solid at different temperatures, which more so thinking of vapors. So think about, solvents, or maybe, painting is probably a common one we've all probably fairly familiar with, where we're rolling the paint on the wall, but we can smell stuff coming off it. That's the vapors coming off it. As you can see with the picture there, we're talking about petrol vapors. So a fume is a particulate in the respiratory world. So it's not petrol fume is probably a common term that we kind of people hear or use, but it's actually petrol vapors. We've got that liquid, we're going into our vehicle, and those vapors are coming off. And then we've got our oxygen deficient environment. So that's most commonly associated with confined spaces. So certainly thinking about if we're in an environment where there's not enough oxygen, we need to select a respirator that is actually going to be providing oxygen, not cleaning out the air, which is sort of the main ones that we'll talk about. So if we can go to the next slide. So thinking about particulates, this is a little video, a quick video that goes for a couple of minutes. We're going to play about how do particulate filters work. So this isn't a 3M video. This is a video that a YouTube channel called Minute Physics put out during the pandemic, delving into the science behind how do these, rated products work and why do they work so well from a filtration point of view. So I hope that you find this interesting. We'll have a little chat after this video if you wanted to play it now.
Prior to March 2020, there's a good chance you didn't know what an N95 mask was, or at least didn't think about them unless you were doing a home repair project with lots of dust, or live in a part of the world with crazy pollution or wildfire smoke. And upon learning about them, you might think, like I did, that an N95 mask is basically a really, really fine strainer, a mesh of fibers with gaps too small for dust and other airborne particles to get through. A strainer filters out particles larger than its openings, but not particles smaller than its openings. So you'd expect that with a mask, after a certain point, small enough particles will sneak through. But this isn't how N95 masks work. The particles they filter are generally much smaller than the gaps between the fibers in the mask. What's more, an N95 mask is actually really good at filtering both the largest and smallest small particles. It's medium-sized small particles that are hardest for it to block. This isn't at all like a strainer, because N95s are much cleverer than strainers. The overarching goal of an N95 mask is instead to get an airborne particle to touch a fiber in the mask. Regardless of how big an airborne particle is, once it touches a fiber, it stays stuck to it and doesn't become airborne again. This isn't anything special about the fibers, but about the size of the particles. At a microscopic scale, everything is sticky, because the weakly attractive force between molecules is more than strong enough to hold very, very small things in place. So you shouldn't think of N95 masks like a fine window screen that keeps insects of a certain size out. You should think of them more like a sticky spider web that can catch an insect of any size as long as it touches a strand. And so N95 masks use a bunch of different clever physics and mechanical tricks to get particles to touch their fibers. First, many spider webs are better than one. Unlike strainers, where stacking many identical ones doesn't improve the filtering at all, more layers of sticky fibers means more chances for particles to get stuck. And how likely particles are to hit or miss a fiber depends in large part on their size. Airborne particles larger than 1/1000 of a millimeter basically travel in straight lines because of their inertia. And because there are so many layers of fibers, their straight line paths are essentially guaranteed to hit a fiber and stick. Airborne particles that are really, really small are so light that collisions with air molecules literally bounce them around, so they move in a random zigzag pattern known as Brownian motion. This zigzagging also makes it super likely that a particle will bump into a fiber and get stuck. Particles of in-between sizes are the hardest to filter. That's because they don't travel in straight lines, and they also don't bounce around randomly. Instead, they're carried along with the air as it flows around fibers, meaning they're likely to get carried past fibers and sneak through even a mask with many layers. But N95 masks have a final trick up their sleeve. They can attract particles of all sizes to them using an electric field. In the presence of an electric field, even neutral particles develop an internal electrical imbalance which attracts them to the source of the field. This is why neutrally charged styrofoam sticks to a cat whose fur has been charged with static electricity. But unlike a cat's fur, an N95 mask's electric field isn't just ordinary static electricity. The fibers are like permanent magnets, but for electricity. Electrets. Just like you can permanently magnetize a piece of iron by putting it in a strong enough magnetic field, you can electritize a piece of plastic to give it a permanent electric field. By electritizing the fibers in an N95 mask, they gain a long-lasting ability to attract particles, which means they capture about 10 times as many particles as regular fibers. And this is, after all, the point of an N95 mask, to filter out particles from the air, and they do it cleverly. By taking advantage of the molecular scale stickiness of matter, using many layers of fibers that catch straight-moving large particles as well as zigzagging small particles, and having an electric field that attracts all particles, you get a mask, not a strainer, that's really good at trapping both large and small airborne particles, and does a reasonably good job at filtering out middle-sized airborne particles. Precisely what fraction of those sneaky medium-sized particles get blocked gives you the number of the mask. If at least 95% of those particles are filtered out, then the mask is rated N95.
The very common question I get asked quite frequently, and so does the 3M team, is, well, what's the smallest size particle that your respirators can filter down to? And from that video, you can probably appreciate it's not quite the right question as opposed to what's the hardest particle size to capture. So it's a bit counterintuitive to think as it gets smaller, a particle, it actually the efficiency goes back up. And that's why whether it's a mist, a fume, a fiber, it all comes down to that particle size. Which is why that same particulate filter, think about P2s or N95s, that we're probably familiar with that term now, captures all these different types of particulates. Obviously have a very different health effect if you were to breathe in these different contaminants, but certainly from a filtration point of view, that's why that same particulate filter will actually capture all of those. Next slide, please. So when I look at the Australian standard particulate filter ratings, and you're probably familiar with some of these, thinking P1, P2, and P3, all of these different types of filter ratings actually get tested to the same particle size. And surprise, surprise, from what we've just learned in that video, the size used is actually the most penetrating particle size, or the hardest particle size to capture, which makes sense when you think about it. We want to have the most challenging particle size. And this is where, a P1 is suitable for mechanically generated particulates. It needs to be at least 80% efficient to the hardest particle size to capture. So this is where we see these different ratings, it's referring to how much of that particle size, that test challenge agent, it actually needs to stop. I'm going to put the next click there for us with a picture. So in that video, it sort of showed these fibers sort of very evenly spaced out that we want these particles to actually touch. But what you're seeing on the screen there is actually one layer from one of our P2 filters there. So the visual analogy I like to use is that a filter bed is a bit like a sticky bowl of spaghetti. Bear with me, but you can kind of see what an actual fiber layer is actually like, where a particle has to zigzag its way through these various layers of fibers and different size fibers as well. So you can see those little white dots there, those different particles that have been caught by the fiber material there. So hopefully have a different appreciation for these different types of products and how and why they work so well from a filtration point of view as well. So yeah, hopefully you've learned something there, if nothing else, from today. Next slide, please. Then the next common question that Motion and 3M do get asked, thinking about particulate filters in general, is, well, when do I need to change my filter? Does it last forever? Do I need to change it after every single use? So the general rule of thumb for particulate filters is when there's unacceptable breathing resistance to airflow. So at that point where the wearer is probably going to be, gee, I'm really having to suck them back in that regard. And we think about our visuals that we've seen and what we've just covered in that video, that the more a particulate filter gets clogged up, it actually becomes a better filter. It becomes harder and harder for stuff to work its way through because those fibers are getting more, bigger, clogged up, if you can visualize that. And so it becomes a better filter, which is not a bad thing. But, conversely, at the same time, that breathing resistance is going to be harder for that wearer to draw that air through in that regard. So that's sort of that general rule of thumb. At what point does that happen? Well, that depends on all the variables of the task. How long are they doing it for? What's the exposure level? What's the work rate? So the whole things that go into it. Also, if there's any physical damage, maybe the strap's broken, from a whole product, or maybe there's welding splatter or grinding sparks have landed on it. Certainly in healthcare, they would, ideally change it after every patient. But that's sort of the general sort of guidance we had, during the pandemic is those 3 Ds: damaged, dirty, and difficult to breathe through, which is going to vary depending on the task, the application, the workplace. And certainly also not to use past expiry and shelf life. And generally, particulate filters in the 3M range have a 5-year from shelf life period before need to use one that is within a service life as well. Then we get into the gas vapor category of things. So I looked at that particulate, thinking about those airborne hazards. We can go to the next slide there. And we've got that middle type of hazard there. This is where we get into gas and vapor contaminants. And so under the Australian standard, there's these different colours. You may be familiar if you've got some on your side. I've got a couple of pictures there where you've also got brown and grey and yellow and green. That's a visual indicator for products that meet the standard from whatever manufacturer are rated to these different test gases. So A is probably the most common and almost common as far as type of hazard, organic vapours and solvents in that regard. The boiling point with the BP there has an impact on how much it migrates through a product. That's a whole other conversation, but certainly if you've got chemicals beneath 65 degrees, do reach out to Motion and we can help you in that regard. You've got your B with your grey, with your acid gases, and yellow, green, and red there. If you can click again for us there. So you'll see these different products with A, B, and E, but you'll also see a number after it, and that's to do with the capacity. So an A1 versus an A2 will both be suitable for organic vapor, but the 2 is more carbon from an analogy point of view, where think of them as different buckets. The bigger the number, the bigger the bucket, the bigger the capacity, the more it can hold. It can hold the same contaminant, but it's going to hold more until that bucket is overflowing from that analogy point of view. Next click, please. And so the capture mechanism is quite different to particulate, where it uses carbon to coat the area. We've got physiabsorption and chemiabsorption mechanisms, but think of it from a surface area point of view, from a capacity. And once that's full, that breakthrough is going to occur. Next click, please. But the key thing I want to, leave with you when we're talking about gas and vapor cartridges, which is different to the particulate filters, is that there's not a gas and vapor cartridge for every type of gas and vapor that may be found in the workplace, where current science is at with manufacturers. So if you were to ring up Motion and say, look, I've got really high levels of carbon monoxide, we're going to say from the 3M range point of view, well, you need to go to a supplied air type of product as well. So that's why coming back to, that hazard identification at the start of the process is so integral to appropriately select filters, or maybe need to go down a different pathway as well. So just to highlight, there isn't a gas and vapor for every type of contaminant you may be dealing with in the workplace. So hence why there's that process. Next slide, please. Similar to the particulate filter and how long do they last, similar to a gas vapor cartridge, there is lots of different variables that go into how long are you doing it for, what's the concentration. From a gas point of view, the boiling point, the relative humidity has an impact on organic vapors, sorbent capacity. I guess the key one I'd highlight as you're reading on the screen there is that a common one is that we'll wait till we can smell the contaminant coming through the gas vapor cartridge. Unfortunately, I'm here to say that should not be used as your primary indicator. There's a whole page in the Australian standard that talks about the reasons why not. What about chemicals that don't have a smell, that you're not going to be able to smell? So if you're relying on that smell, you'll never be able to smell and know when breakthrough is occurring. What about those chemicals that, the odor threshold, to the point that generally people can smell it, is well above the exposure standards. So the time you are smelling it, we're already at an unacceptable risk level in that regard. Certainly there are gases and vapors that you will smell before it gets to those levels. So individual variability? What about, gases like hydrogen sulfide that cause olfactory fatigue, that your sense of smell is degraded over time as well? So we as humans are not a reliable indicator if we're just going to rely on smell. So certainly there's different tools that 3M have, that Motion have access to as well, about helping, with those, trying to determine service life with gas vapor cartridges. It's a whole nother, like I said, depth of topic, but certainly just trying to highlight some of these things to think about in your workplace. And our standard says there, that second last point, that they should be changed after 6 months after opening. These things do not last forever. I can't tell you how many workplaces I've been into, and on their workbench, they've got their respirator with their gas vapor cartridge, and it's sitting out in the open. Well, how long has that been on? How long has that been out there for? I don't know. How long, what's your exposure level? I don't know. So it's not that it's not going to work if a wearer wears it, but certainly, a concern is going to be a percentage or a part of that capacity of that cartridge just being used up just by sitting on a workbench, not protecting the workers, the wearers that the company's provided, the invested in with that equipment. So certainly we want to get the most out of the equipment that we are investing in, and it ultimately comes back to protecting our workers again. So I'm going to see how well you've been listening. Chevel's got some questions that we're going to get you to put into the Q&A side of things. So on to the next slide. So I'm going to, see how you've been going.
Thanks, Mark. So we're just going to run through some quick questions. This is your chance to win some Motion and 3M prize packs. So we do encourage everyone to participate in this. First question here is, which of the following are classified as a particulate? Is it A, fume, B, mist, C, gas, D, fiber, E, vapor, or F, dust? And second question here is, would you change a particular filter? Is it A, whenever you want to, B, never, C, unacceptable breathing resistance, D, damaged respirator, or E, past its shelf life? So we'll give you a couple seconds to answer that. This is also your chance to ask any questions that you have for Mark or Steve. So just pop them in the Q&A panel and we'll go through them.
We'll get to see if people have been listening or they've been doing other emails and work while I've been going through, but hopefully a couple of things are stuck with you there as well.
Yeah. We'll give a couple.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, a lot of things we're talking is from a very high level point of view, but hopefully trying to trigger some of these questions that maybe you hadn't thought about before, or can go back and re-look at what you're doing, or next time that risk assessment comes up as well. So hopefully, so far you've found it useful. Got a couple of things coming through. So if you want me to, do you want to go through the answers, Chevlin, or you want me to tell them the good news?
Yeah, you can go through the answers.
Cool, no worries. All right, for number one, so a fume, mist, fiber, and dust are all particulates. So the ones that are not particulates are the gases and vapors. Thinking about that molecule size contaminants there. So certainly, understanding what those hazards are. One particular workplace I'm thinking of was a number of years ago where they got that fume and vapor part mixed up, and so in their particular documentation they have using the wrong term, and so the filters that they had put in their procedure select was actually incorrect based on that terminology mix up in their procedures. So it is quite important that we understand what is the particulate or gas vapor as well. So then number two, from that particulate filter, you're looking at that unacceptable breathing resistance as that main indicator there, damaged respirator, or if it's past its shelf life. So hopefully you were listening and got a couple of answers in there. So thank you so much, all of the people that have responded. So let's get on to the next one. So now we're going to delve into these respirator types as I sort of cover those two main particulate and gas vapor. So the next slide, when we click through, I like to call it the family tree of respiratory protection from a high level point of view. We've got a couple of examples of a couple of the pictures there where we have those air purifying respirators. So think of air purifying that we have a filter, be it a particulate or gas vapor, that we're capturing the contaminants out of the air as it's passing through the filter. So this is why we need that air to be going through the filter and not around the face piece into it. We've got our filtering face piece, half face and full face, which are negative pressure. So thinking inside the respirator. it's going to be negative pressure as the wearer is breathing in and doing the work to draw the air through, versus our PAPRs, or powered air purifying respirators, a positive pressure where that fan and blower is pumping air up into the head top and creating a positive pressure to prevent those contaminants getting in up into the head top. So both air purifying, both using filters of various types depending on the equipment you got, but both air purifying versus the supplied air or atmosphere supplying type of equipment, where the air, the oxygen is being provided to the wearer from an external source, whether that is hooked up to a compressor, maybe through some cylinders through a trolley there, or a self-contained breathing apparatus. When we think about emergency services where they don't know what they're going to be exposed to going into those types of environments, we're going to bring the air with them, and there's the escape type of equipment. So it's like a high view. We're going to look a little bit closer in some of those air purifying equipment as sort of the more common ones in industry as well. Next slide. So our filtering face piece, or our disposable respirators, I'm sure we're all very familiar with them, and you're probably all very sick of them, having to wear a lot of them during the last couple of years, where the whole face piece is a filter. So certainly from the pros and cons of all these different types of equipment, certainly going to be a lower cost from that point of view. Lightweight, it's got the lower breathing resistance because the whole thing is a filter, and often because of that lightweight, it's going to be compatible with other types of PPE. Next slide. You're going to look at different products that are valved and unvalved. As a common question, what is the valve doing? The valve is a comfort feature. It is allowing that exhaled hot breath to more easily escape the respirator. So certainly thinking of the length of time maybe a person is needing to work or wear a respirator, having those kind of features are going to make it a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more bearable for the wearer to do that. They both have to pass the same tests from the Australian standards point of view of inward leakage. So it's not, they're both protecting the wearer, but thinking about a source control, once again, referring back to what we've all been through the last couple of years, not a source control as far as, it is designed to allow things to escape. So thinking about our COVID terms as well. So different features there depending on those characteristics of source control as well. Next slide. Then we get into the reusable types of respirators, and reusable in the fact that you have replaceable filters, or you have replaceable parts that you can continue to reuse, be it head strap or inhalation valves or exhalation valves, versus the disposable, where it's not that you got to replace after one use, depending on the the context of the use, but certainly not replacing any parts on it, and you would dispose of it once you are finished with it. So your reusables have that inhalation and exhalation valve as well from that comfort feature. You got half face and full face. Each of the 3M products of these face pieces have small, medium, large. So thinking about accommodating the variety of workers and nationalities and characteristics that we all have. And for the full faces, thinking about maybe from another hazard point of view, we do need eye protection as well. So thinking about those multi-hazard type environments, that may be something you may need, or maybe it's a half face and a goggle. Like I said, understanding what those sort of criteria are. Different face pieces have different filter connection types, but certainly thinking about a range of filters are available for all these different 3M face pieces. Then we get to the next one here, which is the powered air purifying respirator, which once again is uses filters. So inside those particular blowers that you can see there, the blower is drawing the air through that filter. So from a comfort point of view, the blower is doing that hard work, so to speak, of pulling that air through. So there's no increased breathing resistance. And you can kind of see from a couple of those pictures there's a variety of different blowers depending on what the contaminant or the hazard is, a variety of different head tops depending on, once again, what the environment is. Do you also need hard hat protection, eye and face impact protection as well? Are you maybe welding, so you need automatic darkening filters? So just trying to highlight, this is, very much we talk about a very modular type of system where understanding what those requirements are will put you down a different pathway to what type of combination is going to be most suitable and adequate. If I use those terminologies again, you can think there's different mounting options for belt. There's backpack ones as well. There's different kits that you can, so just highlighting, it's kind of hard to capture everything in this one slide, but just appreciating that, PAPRs can come across as complex because there's lots of different parts. But that's where, the team at Motion, the team at 3M are here to help you, to step you through that process and understand, in concept, they're pretty straightforward, and understanding, how to use them and workers to get the most out of them. And certainly thinking about the facial hair aspect when we talk about the fit considerations. Loose fitting head tops, sort of the not these tight fitting ones, are suitable for various facial hairstyles. That where their face seal can actually contain, and it's not flowing out of the face seal as well. So, like I said, lots of different potential type of combinations. And so this is what's kind of hard to encapsulate all in this short period about selection, but just trying to make you aware of starting with what your hazards are, and then working through these different types of various options that all have pros and cons that may or may not be suitable for your environment, your workplace, your workers with what they need to do. So just trying to highlight a couple of those as we sort of move into the next part. So on to the next side of things. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into some of these selection considerations, rather than just is it a particulate, is it a gas vapor side of things. On to the next slide, please. So when we're thinking about performance or achieving protection, tight fitting respirators, so thinking about our disposable and reusable ones, three key things that need to be in place. So another key thing, if you take away from today, is it the right filter? From a filtration point of view, if we need a gas and vapor filter, but we need, for gas and vapor, we need a gas and vapor filter, or a particulate for a particulate filter. So I think we've established why that's important. We need compliance. It needs to be worn. I know that sounds a bit silly, but we've probably been enough workplaces ourselves where people have left their PPE in the work truck, on the workbench, in the work cupboard, as well, not out of any deliberate, but there's a lot of things on their mind. But the fact comes, if it's not being worn, and not being worn 100% of the time it needs to be worn, well, clearly that protection is not going to be there. And then we get into the fit aspect. We're going to delve a bit deeper there, and we need all these three things to be in place. If we take one of those things out, that protection is not going to be there. So if we click to the next slide to try and highlight this particular picture here, that's sort of, you may have seen it before, but I use this quite often in training, just trying to illustrate this key point where he's got it on. It is the right filter for the contaminant, but as you can probably hopefully highlight, you may be having a bit of smile to yourself. We pretty obviously have an issue with fit here. Now, I don't think you could more incorrectly fit a respirator if you tried to more incorrectly fit a respirator, other than if you weren't wearing it. But certainly thinking about what we can see here, it's on sideways. We've got a pretty big gap between the face seal and the wearer. And we have facial hair, which we know does have a significant impact on those, protection levels or that inward leakage. And it's not to have a go at this particular individual at all, but certainly in this case, he's been given a piece of PPE, a respirator in this circumstance, and hasn't been given that information, so we can link that back to that training and understanding of what to do. Fitting a respirator is not hard, but certainly we all don't know what we don't know. And little things like putting it the right way up, knowing how to mold the nose piece, goes a long way to achieving no protection, next to no protection, to having some confidence that protection is going to be achieved with that understanding and correct use of that respirator. So, like I said, we've got 2 out of the 3 elements there, but protection probably not going to be there. Next slide, please. So the Australian standard categorises all these different types of respirators by their protection factor. And very quickly and simply, a protection factor is what is the reduction, what's that ratio reduction from outside the respirator to inside the respirator. So CO is concentration outside and CI is concentration inside. So we have a situation where the concentration outside is the same as the concentration inside a respirator. What's the respirator actually doing? Nothing in that particular circumstance. So what we want to see, and what these products are sort of categorized broadly under, is what is that minimum expected ratio of reduction. So if we look at our little analogy or our example here, if we have 20 fairy particles floating on the outside of the respirator and 2 are getting in through whatever pathway, respirators don't eliminate exposure, they reduce exposure. So however that's getting in, it's getting in, we're going to assume it's being breathed in. So if we've got 2 getting in and 20 outside, you can see there we've got a protection factor of 10, or a 10 times reduction in exposure from outside the respirator to inside the respirator. So if we go to the next slide, so this is a visual sort of guide just to sort of highlight different combinations of products have these different assigned protection factors or required minimum protection factor, which is the term that the Australian standard sort of uses. So that bottom line there at the bottom is the workplace exposure standards. So imagine any level above that is an unacceptable exposure level. And so what we need to do with the respirator that we select, whatever that may be, so the higher the exposure, the greater the reduction in exposure we need to bring our wearer's exposure down to that workplace exposure standard at the absolute minimum, but ideally much below that. And so I guess just the point to highlight, protection factors are not just based on the filter level. So we've got a P3, 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 and all the different levels. Yes, it is the highest filtering efficiency particulate filter, but certainly what is it attached to? Half face, full face, is it negative pressure, positive pressure? They're all the things that go into these assigned protection factors that are used as part of the selection. So think of it, the higher over the exposure standard we are, the greater the risk, the greater the reduction we need to provide to our wearer to bring it down to an acceptable level. And those numbers are based on clean shaven, fit tested, trained wearers. So doing all those right things, if that makes sense, to have confidence that at a minimum is going to bring those exposures down. My terrible dad joke is, remember the Coles ads where they talk about down, the prices are down. Usually I'll sing, down, exposures are down. If that helps you think about trying to get those exposures down as low as reasonably practicable. So if we can go on to the next slide. And this is where we get into the suitability aspect. So the first part, what we've touched on, is adequate. Is it right for the hazard? And is it right for the hazard level? We need to bring that level down. And then we get into this suitability aspect. And like I said, this is a real quick high level overview, but thinking about your workplace, what is that working environment? Are they having to climb ladders? Is it a hot thermal environment? Is there a lot of mobility required? So having a big, heavy, SCBA equipment, it may just not be reasonably practical. Thinking about tasks as an example, probably a very extreme example. What other PPEs need to be worn? Thinking about the wearer's individual characteristics, from facial shape, size, their knowledge, their training, what the environment is. If we click on the next slide. As well. So we kind of get this interplaying relationship between all these different things in place, between the compatibility, between the PPE, the wearer, the working environment, thinking about the ergonomics. We had an inquiry last week from a workplace and they're looking at, we like some PAPRs, but we're doing working heights work with ropes as well. So that's a really tough one that we don't have an answer for. We think about, the challenge, but they're asking some of those key questions of where are we doing it? What other types of things are we having to interact with that may mean that a PAPR could be adequate, but it may not be suitable. And then we get into the fit side of things as well. So there's a lot of things going on here that's sort of hard to delve too deep into, but trying to set that scene of thinking about all these other things and just, hey, is it right for silica dust, or is it just right for that, that solvent, that xylene or benzene or toluene that I may be working with, in lots of different working environments. So we go to the next slide, just highlighting this PPE compatibility aspect of things. It's not that it's impossible to wear all these bits of PPE that you can see on the screen, but if you're, if workers need to wear these 4 bits of PPE for 8 hours a day, because that's the hazards that are involved in the task, I know personally, I'm going to get uncomfortable quickly. I'm going to want to adjust different things. So if you can click forward. So looking at, are there options for types of PPE that combine multi-hazard type of protection? So this is one of our PAPR head tops that is a hard hat rated. We can see it's got these optional earmuffs, there's high impact, and we've got respiratory protection as well, all combined into this one type of equipment that's designed and intended to provide this multi-hazard. So not that it's impossible to wear those things, but thinking about, will it be worn? Where a comfort, where a bearability, as I like to use the term, having a look at those different options that are out there. So if we go into the next slide there, so some more questions to see if people were listening again. I haven't put them to sleep, I hope.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So this is just our last set of questions. So third question is, what is the function of an exhalation valve on disposable or reusable respirators? Is it A, allowing air contaminants in, B, allowing hot exhaled breath to quickly escape, C, comfort feature for the wearer, or D, get rid of garlic breath?
Sorry, Stephen, it's not D, mate. It's not the garlic breath, all right? Sorry to call you out there, but
And question 4, what is a protection factor? Is it how much increase the worker is exposed to while wearing a respirator? B, ratio of reduction from outside the respirator to inside the respirator? C, worker's exposure level inside the respirator? Or is it D, how often a worker is protected while wearing a respirator? So we'll give that a couple of minutes and then get Mark to go through the answers.
We should have prepared some of that thinking music that you can have while you're waiting, as well. So maybe a suggestion for your next webinar with questions as
the escalator
well.
Music.
Yeah, in that regard. So hopefully, a couple of the things that we've covered sort of starting to sink in there, thinking about, exhalation valve, comfort, any kind of PPE you're wearing for a period of time is going to make a big difference. So while you're sort of typing that in. We've got a couple of responses there. We have, excellent, we've got a couple of people who have selected B and B, which is correct. So for question 3, allowing hot exhaled air to escape quickly. And then the protection factor is that ratio of reduction from outside the respirator to inside the respirator. They've been listening. All right, fantastic. That's what we like to have confirmed. So we can probably move on to the next lot of slides. As I quickly looking at the time, I need to sort of move through. So a couple of things, next slide, please, is talking about, I've repeated a couple of times, this importance of fit. And there's lots of things that impact fit. It's not just a case of I've just put it on incorrectly. Facial hair is honestly the biggest challenge in workplaces, thinking that facial hair is constantly growing. I don't like to shave if I don't have to, but appreciating that has an impact of fit as well. We've got facial features, obviously a very extreme example picture there, but certainly just thinking about, we've got a very diverse workforce, which is great, but that has an impact on these different respirators and how they may fit as well. Makeup is sort of highlighted in the standard, more thinking about things that will increase the likelihood of that respirator moving around while being warm. Maybe it's sunscreen, thinking about outdoor workers as well. So what are the different things that may impact this fit as that biggest variable? Next slide, please. And this is where, we get a bit deeper into the facial hair side of things. So what you're looking at is actually one of my facial hairs from a little project I did a couple of years ago, trying to, improve some of our, visual tools when talking about these kind of impacts. So you can see a couple of, particulates or aerosols there with the different sizes to the size of one facial hair there. You can click through a couple of times to bring up those study references while we're talking about that here. So just trying to highlight that, the things that we're most concerned about are way smaller than facial hair. And you think about beard and stubble as it pushes up, there's been numerous studies that clearly show that, the presence of facial hair, that expected level of protection is significantly reduced. So a couple of references, they're from the 1980s. So it's not like these are new studies, they're fairly well established. If you go to the next slide. And so the requirement to be clean shaven has been in the standards for a very long time, many decades. I guess I would say there's probably only the last couple of years off the back of the increased cases of silicosis and in Queensland pneumoconiosis with black lung. In that regard, there's been a much more stronger regulatory enforcement or focus on this area. Next slide, please. So when we look at, the leak path around the seal with facial hair versus, what we discussed about the particulate filters and how they work, not even talking about gas vapors going around the seal. Hopefully it's fairly obvious, where that biggest variable is and the challenge is, while I'm focusing so much on fit. Next slide, please. So this is where thinking about, which respirators are suitable for which types of facial hair. Certainly if you're clean shaven, free from facial hair, you're going to get some nice big green ticks along these categories of ranges of respirators. And when we talk about, facial hair, we don't want it in the sealing surface area of the respirator. So for Mr. Mustache there, if we've got a full face that is going around the side of the wearer's face and not interacting with the facial hair on the lip, that's going to be okay. So certainly some styles that can be within the face piece may be okay. Reason for those question marks, as I alluded to before, is we still can't have facial hair flowing out of a loose fitting head top, because it does rely on that positive pressure being maintained, while that respirator is in use as well. So if you've got workers that are already, keep their beard nice and long for Santa season throughout the whole entire year, it may be a case of there may be no respirator suitable for them in that regard. So that hood helmet, that bottom one there, the shroud seals lower around the neck, so you've got more space to be able to roll up in many circumstances and fit the facial hair inside that head top there as well. So there's a question mark because, beards ain't beards unique, but there's certainly going to have to be that assessment, thinking about that wearer receiving reliable and predictable protection through all the range of tasks that they need to do. So something to think about. And there's lots of reasons why people have facial hair, be it religious or personal. So certainly it is a hard thing to have to think about how to manage this, but certainly when we come back to the science, it's very clear on the impact that facial hair has with tight-fitting face pieces and achieving protection. Next slide, please. And this is where we get into this wonderful world of fit testing. Next slide as well. So a fit test is a process to confirm that a fit can be achieved. So a fit test is not a guarantee of protection. you know, I could fit test Steve, but if he chooses not to wear it tomorrow on the job, you know, it still comes back to that the wearer doing the right things, but it's a really important part. So we don't want to be issuing respirators that people just can't achieve a fit because of that compatibility between the respirator and the wearer as well. So if we go to the next slide, and this is another quick little video to highlight that this concept of fit testing is not a new concept, and I say that from many conversations over the last couple of years of workplaces off the increased focus on the regulators or going through the pandemic in healthcare. What's this fit testing? I haven't heard of a fit test before, to sort of go, well, actually, this is a pretty important concept. So this is actually a video from the 1930s. So we can play the video, and I'm keen to think what you think about this particular fit testing methodology.
To make sure it would fit various kinds and sizes of faces, it had to form a dust-tight seal on all types: the long and narrow, the median, the round and full. To test security of fit, coal dust was blown into the air. They breathe deeply, trying to suck in all the dust they can. When the respirators are removed, the sharp white line must show not a sign of leakage around the facepiece. His face is dirty, but his lungs are clean.
So fortunately, I can confirm the fit testing methods have improved since the 1930s and don't require workers to get a head full of coal dust, and also for the health and safety of the fit tester themselves. But certainly just highlighting the fact that this concept or this importance of the fit is not a new thing. You know, certainly, obviously a more raised awareness thinking of the last couple of years, but usually, like I said, that sort of gets a bit of a smile when thinking about, right, yeah, not what we want to be doing today, but appreciating, that's been around for a fair while. So if we go to the next slide, so certainly a couple of these themes I've already highlighted, that every wear is different. As a manufacturer, we do not claim that one particular style, size, be it, half face, full face, disposable, will fit every single person. We know our products fit a very high percentage, most commonly, but it's not a guarantee. We don't guarantee because of the wide variety of characteristics. And I've talked to fit testers, and people have scars on their faces. So that full face is just not going to seal because they have that groove, that's going to be sitting underneath the seal area there. As part of that process of training and confirming the knowledge or passing on or refreshing that knowledge, having that confidence in performance that a respirator will, can fit when worn correctly. And thinking about, maximising the protection, why we're wearing a respirator in the first place, and thinking about complying with the regulations. In the PPE regulations in most states and territories in that Model Act, they talk about, whatever PPE it is being confirmed as an appropriate size, comfort and fit. So definitely from my experience with regulators, fit testing is that way to demonstrate that fit aspect of things. So hence why there's a lot of focus at the moment in the area. So I want to go to the next slide. So when we think of tight-fitting respirators, these are sort of some visual examples of respirators that all require fit testing. And you'll notice sort of that bottom row there and the far right of the second one, they're positive pressure tight-fitting respirators. And so they require fit testing as well, albeit in negative pressure in the fit test. We think about our assigned protection factors of that table, we've got all the different levels as we're going up. So the ones that are generally the positive pressure ones, the ones at the very top of that, assigned protection factor hierarchy. So that number or that high protection factor is based on positive pressure as well as a fit being able to achieve, because they're the type of respirators most commonly that are used in oxygen deficient environments or ideal H, immediately dangerous to life and health environments as well. Hence why that fit testing is required. And those loose fitting head tops, we showed some pictures before, they're the ones that don't require fit testing. So a lot of workplaces are transitioning or considering looking at PAPRs a lot of the time to address that clean shaving, because it is a hard thing to have to manually manage going forward every day, periodically as well. So if we go to the next slide. So there's a few different, if you click twice and bring up these couple of methods here, there's a few different, common methods within Australia, being a qualitative fit test with aerosol taste test. If you can click for Chevron there. And then bring up again. So there's these two different high level, I'll go back one to the fit testing slide, thank you, where we've got the qualitative and quantitative. And I guess just to highlight, there's pros and cons with each these different methods. Some styles are only suitable, or some fit testing methods are only suitable for certain styles of respirators. So certainly just trying to make workplaces more aware that these things exist, and to talk to, your providers, team like Motion at 3M, or maybe a health and safety professional can reach out to the IAOH or an accredited fit tester to talk through the pros and cons and why you may select one over the other. Next slide, please. And so, with this, continued increased regulatory enforcement or focus on fit testing, who can conduct respirator fit testing? This particular ISO standard, which has been voted to become an Australian standard, if you click again for us, highlights these different elements that, a person should be able to demonstrate. It's more than just knowing how to use the machine. This fit testing plays a really important part of a respiratory protection program. When the rubber hits the road, we've selected a respirator, but we need to confirm that a respirator can fit, and that process is a reliable process, and that outcome, whether it passes or doesn't pass, is accurate. And so that could be an internal person, could be an external provider. And if you are looking for fit testers, I highly recommend you go look at the ResFit website, where they do list lots of different accredited fit testers and service providers you can have a chat with to talk you through this stuff, or come out and provide that service for you. So as we wrap up here right at the very end, if we can click to the next one there, let's try and bring this all together here with the next slide here, where we have a picture of some workers. This is an example that we do not recommend you try and replicate, as clearly we can see we have a fair bit of dust visually that's there. So we can click next. So let's break it down into 3 different elements. So, from a respiratory protection, what would be adequate? As in, what is the hazard that we're looking at? So certainly I'd say we probably all thought, dust, where clearly we can see dust. We're doing maybe some construction or demolition work there. So what filter would we select? I'm happy to go out and say I'm probably looking at a particulate filter, but are there gases and vapors there? Thinking about how are these particular bits of equipment being powered? Are we, petrol powered stuff? We're thinking about carbon monoxide. So what is the hazard? And what is that protection factor? What is that reduction in exposure that needs to be given to these workers, or we need to achieve to bring it down to that acceptable risk level, using that workplace exposure standard as that benchmark? Then we get into the suitability side of things. How long are they doing this task for? Is this a 5-minute task? Is this a 6-minute task? Is this a half a day task? Thinking about what they're wearing, the thermal load. Obviously, we've got hard hats here as well. I'm probably thinking you probably want some kind of goggle and eyewear, thinking of that dust situation. Fit. Thinking about the fit testing, or them as individuals knowing how to fit it as well. What are their communication requirements while they've got machinery going? What other hazards are in there? Next slide there. So hopefully, from what we've covered from a high level point of view, just touched on some of these things that may not have considered before, that we need to actually be thinking about on a situation. That's just one example situation. So thinking yourselves of your workplaces or your environments that you may be going into. Put these in the back of your mind, because at the end of the day, will it be worn? And if we sort of skim over some of these sort of selection criteria, it's a good chance it probably won't be worn, or it won't be worn for long, and that protection is not going to be there. So if we go to the next slide, as you sort of went to there as well. So if you've got any other questions, I can't see of any that have sort of come through that's come to mind. I know we're sort of right at the very end here as well. So while people are thinking about that, I don't know if you want to sort of jump to the summary while people are typing in there, just make sure I'm very conscious of the time here. But certainly just trying to highlight the fact that, a respirator can be very effective. No doubt about it. I think hopefully we've highlighted there's a fair bit of science that goes into it, and the standards and the framework around it. But it does come back to that human behaviour, human interaction. When a respirator has been selected, let alone thinking about that selection process that, workplaces, should be going through, can be going through to sort of, consider all these different elements that may be coming into play. I've highlighted in yellow there that sustained whole of organisation approach. It's a big effort, and that's why PP also is at the bottom of the hierarchy, because it takes a lot of effort to maintain, to implement. We're relying on people and behaviours as well. Hence why, thinking about, can we use those higher hierarchy control? We're not relying on that behaviour. Is it ventilation? Is it isolation as well? Or is it a case of those combination and PPE is still required? And at the end of the day, the best one is one that's going to be worn, and that's right for the hazard, suitable, and is correctly being worn the whole time. We can select the best respirator for a situation, but if it's not worn or worn correctly, I think we know what the situation's going to be, which is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to protect our workers day in and day out, with what they need to do as well. So thank you for listening to me sort of go through very quickly a lot of information, but hopefully you've got something out there, and please put some questions in if anything's come to mind while I've been sort of wrapping this up. You're on mute, Steve. Can't quite hear anything at the moment.
Just waiting for any questions. Well, thank you
sorry, no
everyone for
worries.
attending. Today was fantastic. You will be sent an email of this session, so you'll be able to refer back to it when you need. Please keep the questions coming through, both to your rep or your branch. Just a thank you to Chevlin as well for organising today. Thank you for your help, but most importantly, thank you, Mark. Such an insightful presentation. You covered off so many important areas that we probably do take for granted in industry. Please contact your local branch or your rep at Motion for any more information you need, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us all. Loving to help where we can. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day.
Cheers.